Section 22 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 30. Francis I and the Reformation, Part 2. The defeat at Pavia and the captivity of Francis I at Madrid placed the governing power for 13 months in the hands of the most powerful foes of the Reformation, the Regent Louise of Savoy and the Chancellor Duprat. They used it unsparingly, with the harsh indifference of politicians who will have at any price peace within their dominions and submission to authority. It was under their regimen that there took place the first martyrdom decreed and executed in France upon a partisan of the Reformation for an act of aggression and offence against the Catholic Church. John Leclerc, a wool carder at Meaux, seeing a bull of indulgences affixed to the door of Meaux Cathedral, had torn it down, and substituted for it a placard in which the Pope was described as Antichrist. Having been arrested on the spot, he was, by decree of the Parliament of Paris, whipped publicly 3 days consecutively, and branded on the forehead by the hangman in the presence of his mother, who cried, "Jesus Christ for ever!" He was banished, and retired in July 1525 to Metz, and there he was working at his trade when he heard that a solemn procession was to take place next day in the environs of the town. In his blind zeal, he went and broke down the images at the feet of which the Catholics were to have burned incense. Being arrested on his return to the town, he, far from disavowing the deed, acknowledged it and gloried in it. He was sentenced to a horrible punishment. His right hand was cut off, his nose was torn out, pincers were applied to his arms, his nipples were plucked out, his head was confined in 2 circlets of red-hot iron, and whilst he was still chanting in a loud voice this versicle from the 115th Psalm, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands," his bleeding and mutilated body was thrown upon the blazing faggots. He had a younger brother, Peter Leclerc, a simple wool carder like himself, who remained at Meaux, devoted to the same faith and the same cause. "Great Claire," says a contemporary chronicler, playing upon his name, who knew no language but that which he had learned from his nurse, but who, being thoroughly grounded in the holy writings, besides the integrity of his life, was chosen by the weavers and became the first minister of the gospel seen in France. An old man of Meaux, named Stephen Manguin, offered his house, situated near the market-place, for holding regular meetings. 40 or 50 of the faithful formed the nucleus of the little church which grew up. Peter Leclerc preached and administered the sacraments in Stephen Manguin's house so regularly that 20 years after his brother John's martyrdom, the meetings, composed partly of believers who flocked in from the neighbouring villages, were from 300 to 400 in number. One day, when they had celebrated the Lord's Supper, the 8th of September, 1546, the house was surrounded, and nearly 60 persons, men, women, and children, who allowed themselves to be arrested without making any resistance, were taken. They were all sent before the Parliament of Paris. 14 of the men were sentenced to be burned alive in the great market-place at Meaux, on the spot nearest to the house in which the crime of heresy had been committed; and their wives, together with their nearest relatives, were sentenced to be present at the execution, "the men bareheaded, and the women ranged beside them individually, in such sort that they might be distinguished amongst the rest." The decree was strictly carried out. It costs a pang to recur to these hideous exhibitions, but it must be done. For history not only has a right, but is bound to do justice upon the errors and crimes of the past, especially when the past had no idea of guilt in the commission of them. A wit of the last century, Chamfort, used to say, "There is nothing more dangerous than an honest man engaged in a rascally calling." There is nothing more dangerous than errors and crimes of which the perpetrators do not see the absurd and odious character. The contemporary historian Slyden says expressly, "The common people in France hold that there are no people more wicked and criminal than heretics. Generally, as long as they are a prey to the blazing faggots, the people around them are excited to frenzy and curse them in the midst of their torments." The 16th century is that period of French history at which this intellectual and moral blindness cost France "their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands," most dear. It supplied the bad passions of men with a means, of which they amply availed themselves, of gratifying them without scruple and without remorse. If, in the early part of this century, the Reformation was as yet without great leaders, it was not, nevertheless, amongst only the labourers, the humble and the poor, that it found confessors and martyrs. The provincial nobility, the burgesses of the town, the magistracy, the bar, the industrial classes, as well as the learned, even then furnished their quota of devoted and faithful friends. A nobleman, a Picard by birth, born about 1490 at Passy, near Paris, where he generally lived, Louis de Berquin by name, was one of the most distinguished of them by his social position, his elevated ideas, his learning, the purity of his morals, and the dignity of his life. Possessed of a patrimonial estate near Abbeville, which brought him in a modest income of 600 crowns a year, and a bachelor, he devoted himself to study and to religious matters with independence of mind and with a pious heart. "Most faithfully observant," says Erasmus, "of the ordinances and rites of the church, to wit, prescribed fasts, holy days, forbidden meats, masses, sermons, and, in a word, all that tends to piety, he strongly reprobated the doctrines of Luther." He was none the less, in 1523, denounced to the Parliament of Paris as being on the side of the Reformers. He had books, it was said; he even composed them himself on questions of faith, and he had been engaged in some sort of dispute with the theologian William de Coutances, head of Harcourt College. The attorney general of the Parliament ordered one of his officers to go and make an examination of Berquin's books as well as papers, and to seize what appeared to him to savour of heresy. The officer brought away diverse works of Luther, Melancthon, and Carlostadt, and some original treatises of Berquin himself, which were deposited in the keeping of the court. The theological faculty claimed to examine them as being within their competence. On being summoned by the attorney general, Berquin demanded to be present when an inventory was made of his books or manuscripts, and to give such explanations as he should deem necessary, and his request was granted without question. On the 26th of June, 1523, the commissioners of the Sorbonne made their report. On the 8th of July, Peter Lizet, king's advocate, read it out to the court. The matter came on again for hearing on the 1st of August. Berquin was summoned and interrogated, and, as the result of this interrogatory, was arrested and carried off to imprisonment at the Conciergerie in the Square Tower. On the 5th of August, sentence was pronounced, and Louis de Berquin was remanded to appear before the Bishop of Paris, as being charged with heresy, "in which case," says the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, "he would have been in great danger of being put to death according to law, as he had well deserved." The public were as ready as the accusers to believe in the crime and to impatiently await its punishment. It was not without surprise or without displeasure that on the 8th of August, just as they had "made over to the Bishop of Paris, present and accepting," the prisoner confined in the Conciergerie, the members of the council chamber observed the arrival of Captain Frederic, belonging to the archers of the king's guard, and bringing a letter from the king, who changed the venue in Berquin's case so as to decide it himself at his grand council; in consequence of which the prisoner would have to be handed over, not to the bishop, but to the king. The chamber remonstrated. Berquin was no longer their prisoner, the matter had been decided, it was the bishop to whom application must be made. But these remonstrances had been foreseen. The captain had verbal instructions to carry off Louis de Berquin by force in case of a refusal to give him up. The chamber decided upon handing over the bishop's prisoner to the king, contenting themselves with causing the seized books and manuscripts to be burned that very day in the space in front of Notre Dame. It was whilst repairing to the scene of war in Italy, and when he was just entering Melun, where he merely passed through, that the king had given this unexpected order, on the very day, August 5th, on which the Parliament pronounced the decree which sent Berquin to appear before the Bishop of Paris. There is no clear trace of the vigilant protector, or who had so closely watched the proceedings against Berquin, and so opportunely appealed for the king's interference. In any incident of this sort, there is a temptation to presume that the influence was that of Princess Marguerite; but it is not certain that she was at this time anywhere near the king. Perhaps John du Bellay, Bishop of Bayonne, acted for her. Francis I. was, moreover, disposed to extend protection, of his own accord, to gentlemen and scholars against furious theologians, when the latter were not too formidable for him. However that may be, Berquin, on becoming the king's prisoner, was summoned before the chancellor Duprat, who, politely reproaching him with having disquieted the church, confined himself to requesting that he would testify some regret for it. Berquin submitted with a good grace, and being immediately set at liberty, left Paris and repaired to his estate in Picardy. Whilst he there resumed his life of peaceful study, the Parliament continued to maintain in principle and openly proclaim its right of repression against heretics. On the 12th of August, 1523, it caused notice to be given, by sound of trumpet, throughout the whole of Paris, that clergy and laymen were to deposit in the keeping of the palace all Luther's books that they possessed. Laymen who did not comply with this order would have their property confiscated. Clergymen would be deprived of their temporalities and banished. Toleration, in a case of suspected heresy, was an act of the king's which itself required toleration. Proceedings against heresy remained the law of the land, constantly hanging over every head. 18 months later, in May 1525, there seemed to be no further thought about Berquin. But the battle of Pavia was lost. Francis I. was a prisoner at Madrid. Louise of Savoy and the Chancellor Duprat wielded the power. The question of heretics again came to the front. "The queen must be told," said Pierre Lizet, king's advocate, as St. Gregory told Bruno, queen of the Franks, that the best way of driving away the enemies of the kingdom is to drive away from it the enemies of God and his spouse, the church. On the 10th of April, 1525, on occasion of giving the regent some counsel as to her government, the Parliament strongly recommended her to take proceedings against the heretics. "The court," they said to her, "has before now passed several provisional decrees against the guilty, which have not been executed because of the evil disposition of the times and the hindrances effected by the delinquents, who have found means of suspending and delaying the judgments given against them, as well as by transference of the venue to the Grand Council, as by seizure and removal of certain of them, prisoners at the time, whom they have had withdrawn from their prisons, by exercise of sovereign and absolute power, which has given the rest occasion and boldness to follow the evil doctrine." It was impossible to reproach the king more broadly with having set Berquin at liberty. The Parliament further advised the regent to ask the pope to send over to France pontifical delegates invested with his own powers to watch and to try in his name "even archbishops, bishops, and abbots who by their deeds, writings, or discourses should render themselves suspected of a leaning towards heresy." Louise of Savoy, without any appearance of being hurt by the attack made by the Parliament on the acts of the king her son, eagerly followed the advice given her; and on the 20th of May, 1525, Clement VII., in his turn, eagerly appointed 4 delegates commissioned to try all those suspected of heresy, who, in case of condemnation, were to be left to the secular arm. On the very day on which the pope appointed his delegates, the Faculty of Theology at Paris passed censure upon diverse writings of Erasmus, translated and spread abroad in France by Berquin; and on the 8th of January, 1526, the Bishop of Amiens demanded of the Parliament authority "to order the body to be seized of Louis de Berquin, who resided in his diocese and was scandalizing it by his behavior." The Parliament authorized his arrest, and on the 24th of January Berquin was once more a prisoner in the Conciergerie, at the same time that orders were given to seize all his books and papers, whether at his own house or that of his friend the Lord of Rambure at Abbeville. The great trial of Berquin for heresy was recommenced, and in it the great name of Erasmus was compromised. When the question was thus solemnly reopened, Berquin's defenders were much excited. Defenders, we have said; but in truth history names but one, the Princess Marguerite, who alone showed any activity, and alone did anything to the purpose. She wrote at once to the king, who was still at Madrid. "My desire to obey your commands was sufficiently strong without having it redoubled by the charity you have been pleased to show to poor Berquin according to your promise. I feel sure that he, for whom I believe him to have suffered, will approve of the mercy which, for his honor, you have had upon his servant and yours." Francis I. had in fact written to suspend until his return the proceedings against Berquin, as well as those against Lefebvre, Roussel, and all the other doctors suspected of heresy. The regent transmitted the king's orders to the pope's delegates, who presented themselves on the 20th of February before the Parliament to ask its advice. "The king is as badly advised as he himself is good," said the dean of the Faculty of Theology. The Parliament answered that, "for a simple letter missive," it could not adjourn; it must have a letter patent, and it went on with the trial. Berquin presented several demands for delay, evidently in order to wait for the king's return and personal intervention. The court refused them, and on the 5th of March, 1526, the judgment was read to him in his prison at the Conciergerie. It was to the effect that his book should be again burned before his eyes, that he should declare his approval of so just a sentence, and that he should earn the compassion of the church by not refusing her any satisfaction she might demand, else he should himself go to the stake. Whilst Berquin's trial was thus coming to an end, Francis I. was entering France once more in freedom, crying, "So I am king again." During the latter days of March, amongst the numerous personages who came to congratulate him was John de Selve, premier president of the Parliament of Paris. The king gave him a very cold reception. "My lords," wrote the premier president to his court, "I heard through M. de Selve, my nephew, about some displeasure that was felt as regards our body, and I also perceived it myself. I have already begun to speak of it to Madame (the king's mother). I will do, as I am bound to, my duty towards the court, with God's help." On the 1st of April, the king, who intended to return by none but slow stages to Paris, wrote from Mont de Marsan to the judges holding his court of Parliament at Paris, "We have presently been notified how that, notwithstanding that through our dear and much loved lady and mother, regent in France during our absence, it was written unto you and ordered that you would be pleased not to proceed in any way whatever with the matter of Sieur Berquin, lately detained a prisoner, until we should have been enabled to return to this our kingdom, you have nevertheless, at the request and pursuance of his ill wishers, so far proceeded with his business that you have come to a definitive judgment on it. Whereat we cannot be too much astounded. For this cause we do will and command and enjoin upon you that you are not to proceed to execution of the said judgment, which, as the report is, you have pronounced against the said Berquin, but shall put him, himself and the depositions and the proceedings in his said trial in such safe keeping that you may be able to answer to us for them. And take care that you make no default therein, for we do warn you that, if default there be, we shall look to such of you as shall seem good to us to answer to us for it." Here was not only a letter patent, but a letter minatory. As to the execution of their judgment, the Parliament obeyed the king's injunction, maintaining, however, the principle as well as the legality of Berquin's sentence, and declaring that they awaited the king's orders to execute it. "According to the teaching of the two Testaments," they said, "God ever rageth in his just wrath against the nations who fail to enforce respect for the laws prescribed by himself. It is important, moreover, to hasten the event, in order as soon as possible to satisfy, independently of God, the people who murmur and whose impatience is becoming verily troublesome." Francis I. did not reply. He would not have dared, even in thought, to attack the question of principle as to the chastisement of heresy, and he was afraid of weakening his own authority too much if he humiliated his Parliament too much. It was sufficient for him that he might consider Berquin's life to be safe. Kings or protectors who are easily satisfied when their protection, to be worth anything, might entail upon them the necessity of an energetic struggle and of self-compromise. "Trust not in princes nor their children," said Lord Strafford, after the psalmist when, in the 17th century, he found that Charles I. was abandoning him to the English Parliament and the executioner. Louis de Berquin might have felt similar distrust as to Francis I., but his nature was confident and hopeful. When he knew of the king's letter to the Parliament, he considered himself safe, and he testified as much to Erasmus in a long letter, in which he told him the story of his trial, and alluded to "the fresh outbreak of anger on the part of those hornets who accuse me of heresy," said he, "simply because I have translated into the vulgar tongue some of your little works, wherein they pretend that they have discovered the most monstrous pieces of impiety." He transmitted to Erasmus a list of the paragraphs which the pope's delegates had condemned, pressing him to reply, "as you well know how. The king esteems you much, and will esteem you still more when you have heaped confusion on this brood of benighted theologians whose ineptitude is no excuse for their violence." By a strange coincidence, Berquin's most determined foe, Noel Bedat, provost of the Sorbonne, sent at the same time to Erasmus a copy of more than 200 propositions which had been extracted from his works, and against which he, Bedat, also came forward as accuser. Erasmus was a prudent man, and did not seek strife; but when he was personally and offensively attacked by enemies against whom he was conscious of his strength, He exhibited it proudly and ably, and he replied to Beda by denouncing him, on the 6th of June, to the Parliament of Paris itself, as an impudent and ignorant calumniator. His letter, read at the session of Parliament on the 5th of July, 1526, was there listened to with profound deference, and produced a sensation which did not remain without effect. In vain did Beda persist in accusing Erasmus of heresy, and in maintaining that he was of the brotherhood of Luther. Parliament considered him in the wrong, provisionally prohibited the booksellers from vending his libels against Erasmus, and required previous authorization to be obtained for all books destined for the press by the rectors of the Sorbonne. End of section 22. Section 23 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in a public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 30. Francis I and the Reformation, Part 3. The success of Erasmus was also a success for Berquin. But he was still in prison, ill and maltreated. The king wrote on the 11th of July to Parliament to demand that he should enjoy at least all the liberties that the prison would admit of, that he should no longer be detained in an unhealthy cell, and that he should be placed in that building of the Conciergerie where the courtyard was. "That," was the answer, "would be a bad precedent. They never put in the courtyard convicts who had incurred the penalty of death." An offer was made to Berquin of the chamber reserved for the greatest personages, for princes of the blood, and of permission to walk in the courtyard for 2 hours a day, one in the morning and the other in the evening, in the absence of the other prisoners. Neither the king nor Berquin was inclined to be content with these concessions. The king, in his irritation, sent from Beaugency, on the 5th of October, 2 archers of his guard with a letter to this effect: "It is marvellously strange that what we ordered has not yet been done. We do command and most expressly enjoin upon you, this once for all, that you are incontinently to put and deliver the said Berquin into the hands of the said Texier and Charles de Broc, whom we have ordered to conduct him to our castle of the Louvre." The court still objected. A prisoner favored by so high a personage, it was said, would soon be out of such a prison. The objection resulted in a formal refusal to obey. The provost of Paris, John de la Barre, the king's premier gentleman, was requested to repair to the palace and pay Berquin a visit, to ascertain for himself what could be done for him. Berquin, for all that appears, asked for nothing but liberty to read and write. "It is not possible," was the reply. "Such liberty is never granted to those who are condemned to death." As a great favor, Berquin was offered a copy of the Letters of St. Jerome and some volumes of history; and the provost had orders not to omit that fact in his report. "The king must be fully assured that the court do all they can to please him." But it was to no purpose. On the 19th of November, 1526, the provost of Paris returned to the palace with a letter from the king, formally commanding him to remove Berquin and transfer him to the Louvre. The court again protested that they would not deliver over the said Berquin to the said provost, but, they said, "seeing what the times are, the said provost will be able to find free access to the Conciergerie, for to do there what he hath a mind to." The same day, about 6 in the evening, John de la Barre repaired to the Conciergerie, and removed from it Louis de Berquin, whom he handed over to the captain of the guard and 4 archers, who took him away to the Louvre. 2 months afterwards, in January 1527, Princess Marguerite married Henri d'Albret, King of Navarre, and about the same time, though it is difficult to discover the exact day, Louis de Berquin issued forth a free man from the Louvre, and the new queen, on taking him at once into her service, wrote to the Constable Anne de Montmorency, whom the king had charged with the duty of getting Berquin set at liberty, "I thank you for the pleasure you have done me in the matter of poor Berquin, whom I esteem as much as if he were myself; and so you may say that you have delivered me from prison, since I consider in that light the pleasure done to me." Marguerite's sympathetic joy was as natural as touching. She must have thought Berquin safe; he was free and in the service of one who was fundamentally a sovereign prince, though living in France and in dependence upon the King of France, whose sister he had just married. In France, Berquin was under the stigma of having been condemned to death as a heretic, and was confronted by determined enemies. In so perilous a position, his safety depended upon his courting oblivion. But instead of that, and consulting only the dictates of his generous and blind confidence in the goodness of his cause, he resolved to assume the offensive and to cry for justice against his enemies. "Beneath the cloak of religion," he wrote to Erasmus, "the priests conceal the vilest passions, the most corrupt morals, and the most scandalous infidelity. It is necessary to rend the veil which covers them, and boldly bring an accusation of impiety against the Sorbonne, Rome, and all their flunkies." Erasmus, justly alarmed, used all his influence to deter him; but "the more confidence he showed," says he, "the more I feared for him. I wrote to him frequently, begging him to get quit of the case by some expedient, or even to withdraw himself on the pretext of a royal ambassadorship obtained by the influence of his friends. I told him that the theologians would probably, as time went on, let his affair drop, but that they would never admit themselves to be guilty of impiety. I told him to always bear in mind what a hydra was that Bédat, and at how many mouths he belched forth venom. I told him to reflect well that he was about to commit himself with a foe that was immortal, for a faculty never dies, and to rest assured that, after having brought 3 monks to bay, he would have to defend himself against numerous legions, not only opulent and powerful, but besides very dishonest and very experienced in the practice of every kind of cheatery, who would never rest until they had effected his ruin, were his cause as just as Christ's. I told him not to trust too much to the king's protection, the favor of princes being unstable, and their affections easily alienated by the artifices of informers; and if all this could not move him, I told him not to involve me in his business, for, with his permission, I was not at all inclined to get into any tangle with legions of monks and a whole faculty of theology. But I did not succeed in convincing him. Whilst I argued in so many ways to deter him from his design, I did nothing but excite his courage." Not only did Berquin turn a deaf ear to the wise counsels of Erasmus, but his protectress, Marguerite, being moved by his courage, and herself also as imprudent as she was generous, persuaded herself that he was in the right, and supported him in his undertaking. She wrote to the king her brother, "Poor Berquin, who, through your goodness, holds that God has twice preserved his life, throws himself upon you, having no longer any one to whom he can have recourse, for to give you to understand his innocence. And whereas, Monseigneur, I know the esteem in which you hold him, and the desire he hath always had to do you service, I do not fear to entreat you, by letter instead of speech, to be pleased to have pity on him. And if it please you to show signs of taking his matter to heart, I hope that the truth, which he will make to appear, will convict the forgers of heretics of being slanderers and disobedient towards you rather than zealots for the faith." In his complaisance and indifference, Francis I. attended to his sister's wishes, and appeared to support Berquin in his appeal for a fresh and definite investigation of his case. On the other hand, Parliament, to whom the matter was referred, showed a disposition to take into account the king's good will towards Berquin, lately convicted, but now become in his turn plaintiff and accuser. "We have no wish to dispute your power," said the president, Charles de Guillard, to the king at a bed of justice held on the 24th of July, 1527. "It would be a species of sacrilege, and we know well that you are above the laws, and that neither laws nor ordinances can constrain you. Your most humble and most obedient court is comforted and rejoiced at your presence and advent, just as the apostles were when they saw their God after the resurrection. We are assured that your will is to be the peculiar protector and defender of religion, and not to permit or suffer in your kingdom any errors, heresies, or false doctrines." The matter thus reopened pursued its course slowly. 12 judges were appointed to give a definite decision, and the king himself nominated 6, amongst whom he placed Berquin's friend, William Bude. Various incidents unconnected with religious disputes supervened. The Queen of Navarre was brought to bed at Pau, on the 7th of January, 1528, of a daughter, Jeanne d'Albret, the future mother of Henry IV. The marriage of Princess Renee of France, daughter of Louis XII., with Duke Hercule of Ferrara, was concluded, and the preparations for its celebration were going on at Fontainebleau, when, on Monday, June 1st, 1528, the day after the feast of Pentecost, "some heretics came by night," says the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, "to an image of Notre Dame de Pierre, which is at a corner of the street behind the church of Petit Saint Antoine; to the which image they gave several blows with their weapons, and cut off her head and that of her little child our Lord; but it was never known who the image breakers were. The king, being then at Paris, and being advertised thereof, was so wroth and upset that it is said he wept right sore; and incontinently, during the 2 days following, he caused it to be proclaimed by sound of trumpet throughout the cross roads of the city, that if any persons knew who had done it, they should make their report and statement to justice and to him, and he would give them 1,000 crowns of gold. Nevertheless, nothing could be known about it, although the king showed great diligence in the matter, and had officers commissioned to go from house to house to make inquiry. On Tuesday and other days following, there were special processions from the parish churches and other churches of the city, which nearly all of them went to the said place. And on the day of the Fête Dieu, which was the 11th day of the said month of June, the king went in procession, most devoutly, with the parish of St. Paul and all the clergy, to the spot where was the said image. He himself carried a lighted waxen taper, bareheaded, with very great reverence, having with him the band and hautbois with several clarions and trumpets, which made a glorious show, so melodiously did they play. And with him were the Cardinal of Lorraine and several prelates and great lords, and all the gentlemen, having each a taper of white wax in their hands, and all his archers had each a waxen taper alight, and thus they went to the spot where was the said image, with very great honor and reverence, which was a beautiful sight to see, and with devotion." In the 16th century, men were far from understanding that respect is due to every religious creed sincerely professed and practised. The innovators who broke the images of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus did not consider that by thus brutally attacking that which they regarded as a superstition, they were committing a revolting outrage upon Christian consciences. Such an incident was too favorable for Berquin's enemies not to be eagerly turned to profit by them. Although his prosecution had been resumed, he had hitherto remained at large, and been treated respectfully. He repaired without any guard over him from the Louvre to the Palace of Justice. But now he was arrested, and once more confined in the tower of the Conciergerie. Some books of his, seized haphazard and sent to the syndic Bédat, were found covered with notes, which were immediately pronounced to be heretical. On the 16th of April, 1529, he was brought before the court. "Louis Berquin," said the president to him, "you are convicted of having belonged to the sect of Luther, and of having made wicked books against the majesty of God and of his glorious mother. In consequence, we do sentence you to make honorable amends, bareheaded and with a waxen taper alight in your hand, in the great court of the palace, crying for mercy to God, the king, and the law, for the offence by you committed. After that, you will be conducted bareheaded and on foot to the Place de Greve, where your books will be burned before your eyes. Then you will be taken in front of the church of Notre Dame, where you will make honorable amends to God and to the glorious Virgin his mother. After which a hole will be pierced in your tongue, that member wherewith you have sinned. Lastly, you will be placed in the prison of M. de Paris, or the bishop, and will be there confined between 2 stone walls for the whole of your life. And we forbid that there be ever given you book to read or pen and ink to write." This sentence, which Erasmus called atrocious, appeared to take Berquin by surprise. For a moment he remained speechless, and then he said, "I appeal to the king." Whereupon he was taken back to prison. The sentence was to be carried out the same day about 3 p.m. A great crowd of more than 20,000 persons, says a contemporary chronicler, rushed to the bridges, the streets, the squares, where this solemn expiation was to take place. The commissioner of police, the officer of the Châtelet, the archers, crossbowmen, and arquebusiers of the city had repaired to the palace to form the escort. But when they presented themselves at the prison to take Berquin, he told them that he had appealed to the king, and that he would not go with them. The escort and the crowd retired disappointed. The president convoked the tribunal the same evening, and, repairing to the prison, he made Berquin sign the form of his appeal. William Bude hurried to the scene, and vehemently urged the prisoner to give it up. "A second sentence," said he, "is ready, and it pronounces death. If you acquiesce in the first, we shall be able to save you later on. All that is demanded of you is to ask pardon, and have we not all need of pardon?" It appears that for a moment Berquin hesitated, and was on the point of consenting; but Bude remained anxious. "I know him," said he; "his ingenuousness and his confidence in the goodness of his cause will ruin him." The king was at Blois, and his sister Marguerite at Saint Germain. On the news of this urgent peril, she wrote to her brother, I for the last time make you a very humble request. It is that you will be pleased to have pity upon poor Berquin, whom I know to be suffering for nothing but loving the word of God and obeying yours. You will be pleased, Monseigneur, so to act that it be not said that separation has made you forget your most humble and most obedient subject and sister, Marguerite." We can discover no trace of any reply whatever from Francis I. According to most of the documentary evidence, uncertainty lasted for 3 days. Berquin persisted in his resolution. "No," he to his friend Bude, who again came to the prison, "I would rather endure death than give my approval, even by silence only to condemnation of the truth." The president of the court went once more to pay him a visit, and asked him if he held to his appeal. Berquin said yes. The court revised its original sentence, and for the penalty of perpetual imprisonment substituted that of the stake. On the 22nd of April, 1529, according to most of the documents, but on the 17th, according to the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, which the details of the last days render highly improbable, the officers of Parliament entered Berquin's gloomy chamber. He rose quietly and went with them. The procession set out, and at about 3 arrived at the Place de Grève, where the stake was ready. "Berquin had a gown of velvet, garments of satin and damask, and hosen of gold thread," says the Bourgeois de Paris. "Alas!" said some as they saw him pass, "he is of noble lineage, a mighty great scholar, expert in science and subtle withal, and nevertheless he hath gone out of his senses." We borrow the account of his actual death from a letter of Erasmus, written on the evidence of an eye witness. "Not a symptom of agitation appeared either in his face or the attitude of his body. He had the bearing of a man who is meditating in his cabinet on the subject of his studies, or in a temple on the affairs of heaven. Even when the executioner, in a rough voice, proclaimed his crime and its penalty, the constant serenity of his features was not at all altered. When the order was given him to dismount from the tumbrel, he obeyed cheerfully, without hesitating. Nevertheless, he had not about him any of that audacity, that arrogance, which, in the case of malefactors, is sometimes bred of their natural savagery. Everything about him bore evidence to the tranquillity of a good conscience. Before he died, he made a speech to the people, but none could hear him, so great was the noise which the soldiers made, according, it is said, to the orders they had received. When the cord which bound him to the post suffocated his voice, not a soul in the crowd ejaculated the name of Jesus, whom it is customary to invoke, even in favor of parricides and the sacrilegious, to such extent was the multitude excited against him by those folks who are to be found everywhere, and who can do anything with the feelings of the simple and ignorant." Theodore de Beze adds that the grand penitentiary of Paris, Merlin, who was present at the execution, said, as he withdrew from the still smoking stake, "I never saw any one die more Christianly." The impressions and expressions of the crowd, as they dispersed, were very diverse, but the majority cried, "He was a heretic." Others said, "God is the only just judge, and happy is the man whom he absolves." Some said below their breath, "It is only through the cross that Christ will triumph in the kingdom of the Gauls." A man went up to the Franciscan monk who had placed himself at Berquin's side in the procession, and had entreated him without getting from him anything but silence, and asked him, "Did Berquin say that he had erred?" "Yes, certainly," answered the monk, "and I doubt not but that his soul hath departed in peace." This expression was reported to Erasmus, but "I don't believe it," said he. "It is the story that these fellows are obliged to invent, after their victim's death, to appease the wrath of the people." Section 24 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 30. Francis I and the Reformation, Part 4. We have dealt in detail upon these two martyrs, Leclerc and Berquin, the wool carder and the scholarly gentleman, because they are faithful and vivid representatives of the two classes amongst which, in the 16th century, the Reformation took root in France. It had a double origin, morally and socially, one amongst the people and the other amongst the aristocratic and the learned. It was not national, nor was it embraced by the government of the country. Persecution was its first and its only destiny in the reign of Francis I., and it went through the ordeal with admirable courage and patience. It resisted only in the form of martyrdom. We will give no more of such painful and hideous pictures. In connection with this subject, and as regards the latter portion of this reign, we will dwell upon only those general facts which bear the impress of public morals and the conduct of the government rather than of the fortunes and the feelings of individuals. It was after Francis I.'s time that the Reformation, instead of confining itself to submitting with dignity to persecution, made a spirited effort to escape from it by becoming a political party and taking up, in France, the task of the opposition, a liberal and an energetic opposition, which claims its rights and its securities. It then took its place in French history as a great public power, organized and commanded by great leaders, and no longer as a multitude of scattered victims falling one after another, without a struggle, beneath the blows of their persecutors. The martyrdom of Berquin put a stop to the attempt at quasi tolerance in favor of aristocratic and learned reformers which Francis I. had essayed to practice. After having twice saved Berquin from a heretic's doom, he failed to save him ultimately; and, except the horrible details of barbarity in the execution, the scholarly gentleman received the same measure as the wool carder, after having been, like him, true to his faith and to his dignity as a man and a Christian. Persecution thenceforward followed its course without the king putting himself to the trouble of applying the drag for anybody. His sister Marguerite alone continued to protect, timidly and dejectedly, those of her friends amongst the Reformers whom she could help or to whom she could offer an asylum in Bearn, without embroiling herself with the king her brother and with the Parliaments. We will not attempt to enumerate the martyrdoms which had to be undergone by the persevering Reformers in France between 1529 and 1547, from the death of Louis de Berquin to that of Francis I. The task would be too long, and intermingled with too many petty questions of dates or proper names. We will confine ourselves to quoting some local computations and to conning over the great historic facts which show to what extent the persecution was general and unrelenting, though it was ineffectual. In the end, to stifle the Reformation and to prevent the bursting out of those religious wars which, from the death of Francis I. to the accession of Henry IV., smothered France in disaster, blood, and crime. In the reign of Francis I., from 1524 to 1547, 81 death sentences for heresy were executed. At Paris only, from the 10th of November to the 2nd of May, a space of some 6 months, 102 sentences to death by fire for heresy were pronounced. 27 were executed, 2 did not take place, because those who ought to have undergone them denounced other reformers to save themselves, and 73 succeeded in escaping by flight. The Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, pages 444 to 450, does not mention sentences to lesser penalties. In a provincial town, whose history one of its most distinguished inhabitants, M. Boutiot, has lately written from authentic documents and local traditions, at Troyes, in fact, in 1542 and 1546, 2 burgesses, one a clerk and the other a publisher, were sentenced to the stake and executed for the crime of heresy, "on an appeal being made by the publisher, Mas Moreau, the Parliament of Paris confirmed the sentence pronounced by the bailiff's court," and he underwent his punishment on the Place Saint-Pierre with the greatest courage. The decree of the Parliament contains the most rigorous enactments against books in the French language treating of religious matters; and it enjoins upon all citizens the duty of denouncing those who, publicly or not, make profession of the new doctrine. "The Lutheran propaganda," say the documents, "is in great force throughout the diocese. It exercises influence not only on the class of artisans, but also amongst the burgesses. Doubt has made its way into many honest souls. The Reformation has reached so far even where the schism is not complete. Catholic priests profess some of the new doctrines, at the same time that they remain attached to their offices. Many bishops declare themselves partisans of the Reformist doctrines. The Protestant worship, however, is not yet openly conducted. The mass of the clergy do not like to abandon the past; they cling to their old traditions, and if they have renounced certain abuses, they yield only on a few points of little importance. The new ideas are spreading, even in the country. Statues representing the Virgin and the saints are often broken, and these deeds are imputed to those who have adopted the doctrines of Luther and of Calvin. A Notre Dame de Pitié, situated at the Hotel Dieu le Comte, was found with its head broken. This event excites to madness the Catholic population. The persecutions continue." Many people emigrated for fear of the stake. "From August 1552 to the 6th of January 1555," says the chronicler, "Troyes loses in consequence of exile, probably voluntary, a certain number of its best inhabitants," and he names 13 families with the style and title of "noblemen." He adds, "There is scarcely a month in the year when there are not burned 2 or 3 heretics at Paris, Meaux, and Troyes, and sometimes more than a dozen." Troyes contained at that time, says M. Boutiot, 18,285 inhabitants, counting 5 persons to a household. Many other provincial towns offered the same spectacle. During the long truce which succeeded the peace of Cambrai, from 1532 to 1536, it might have been thought for a while that the persecution in France was going to be somewhat abated. Policy obliged Francis I. to seek the support of the Protestants of Germany against Charles V. He was incessantly fluctuating between that policy and a strictly Catholic and papal policy. By marrying his son Henry, on the 28th of October, 1533, to Catherine de' Medici, niece of Pope Clement VII., he seemed to have decided upon the latter course. But he had afterwards made a movement in the contrary direction. Clement VII. had died on the 26th of September, 1524; Paul III. had succeeded him, and Francis I. again turned towards the Protestants of Germany. He entered into relations with the most moderate amongst their theologians, with Melancthon, Bucer, and Sturm. There was some talk of conciliation, of a re establishment of peace and harmony in the church. Nor did the king confine himself to speaking by the mouths of diplomatists. He himself wrote to Melancthon on the 23d of June, 1535, "It is some time now since I heard from William de Bullet, my chamberlain and councillor, of the zeal with which you are exerting yourself to appease the altercations to which Christian doctrine has given rise. I now hear that you are very much disposed to come to us for to confer with some of our most distinguished doctors as to the means of re establishing in the church that sublime harmony which is the chief of all my desires. Come, then, either in an official capacity or in your own private character; you will be most welcome to me, and you shall in either case have proof of the interest I feel in the glory of your own Germany and in the peace of the world." Melancthon had indeed shown an inclination to repair to Paris. He had written on the 9th of May, 1535, to his friend Sturm, "I will not let myself be stopped by domestic ties or by fear of danger. There is no human greatness before which I do not prefer Christ's glory. One thought alone gives me pause: I doubt my ability to do any good. I fear it is impossible to obtain from the king that which I regard as necessary for the Lord's glory and for the peace of France. You know that kingdom; pronounce your judgment. If you think that I shall do well to undertake the journey, I am off." Melancthon had good reason to doubt whether success, such as he deemed necessary, were possible. Whilst Francis I. was making all these advances to the Protestants of Germany, he was continuing to proceed against their brother Christians in France more bitterly and more flagrantly than ever. 2 recent events had very much envenomed party feeling between the French Catholics and Reformers, and the king had been very much compromised in this fresh crisis of the struggle. In 1534, the lawless insurrection of Anabaptists and peasants, which had so violently agitated Germany in 1525, began again. The insurgents seized the town of Munster in Westphalia, and there renewed their attempt to found the kingdom of Israel, with community of property and polygamy. As in 1525, they were promptly crushed by the German princes, Catholic and Protestant, of the neighborhood. But their rising had created some reverberation in France, and the Reformers had been suspected of an inclination to take part in it. "It is said," wrote the Chancellor de Granville in January 1535 to the ambassador of France at the court of Charles V., "that the number of the strayed from the faith in France and the danger of utter confusion are very great. The enterprise of the said strayed, about which you write to me, to set fire to the churches and pillage the Louvre, proves that they were in great force. Please God, the king may be able to apply a remedy." The accusation was devoid of all foundation. But nothing is absurd in the eyes of party hatred and suspicion, and an incident, almost contemporaneous with the fresh insurrection of the Anabaptists, occurred to increase the king's wrath, as well as the people's, against the Reformers, and to rekindle the flames of persecution. On the 24th of October, 1534, placards against the mass, transubstantiation, and the regimen as well as the faith of the Catholic church were posted up during the night in the thoroughfares of Paris, and at Blois on the very chamber door of Francis I., whose first glance, when he got up in the morning, they caught. They had been printed at Neufchatel in Switzerland, where the influence of the refugee William Farel was strong, and their coarse violence of expression could not fail to excite the indignation of even the most indifferent Catholics. In their fanatical blindness, factions say only what satisfy their own passions, without considering moral propriety or the effect which will be produced by their words upon the feelings of their adversaries, who also have creeds and passions. Francis I., equally shocked and irritated, determined to give the Catholic faith striking satisfaction, and Protestant audacity a bloody lesson. On the 21st of January, 1535, a solemn procession issued from the church of Saint Germain Auxerrois. John du Bellay, Bishop of Paris, held in his hands the Holy Sacrament, surrounded by the three sons of France and the Duc de Vendome, who were the dais bearers, and the king walked behind, with a taper in his hand, between the Cardinals of Bourbon and Lorraine. At each halting place he handed his taper to the Cardinal of Lorraine, folded his hands, and, humbly prostrating himself, implored divine mercy for his people. After the procession was over, the king, who had remained to dine with John du Bellay, assembled in the great hall of the palace the heads of all the companies, and, taking his place on a sort of throne which had been prepared for him, said, "Whatever progress may have already been made by the pest, the remedy is still easy if each of you, devoured by the same zeal as I, will forget the claims of flesh and blood to remember only that he is a Christian, and will denounce without pity all those whom he knows to be partisans or favorers of heresy. As for me, if my arm were gangrened, I would have it cut off, though it were my right arm; and if my sons who hear me were such wretches as to fall into such execrable and accursed opinions, I would be willing to give them up to make a sacrifice of them to God." On the 29th of January there was published an edict which sentenced concealers of heretics, "Lutheran or other," to the same penalties as the said heretics, unless they denounced their guests to justice; and a quarter of the property to be confiscated was secured to the denouncers. 15 days previously, Francis I. had signed a decree still stranger for a king who was a protector of letters. He ordered the abolition of printing, that means of propagating heresies, and "forbade the printing of any book on pain of the halter." 6 weeks later, however, on the 26th of February, he became ashamed of such an act, and suspended its execution indefinitely. Punishments in abundance preceded and accompanied the edicts. From the 10th of November, 1534, to the 3rd of May, 1535, 24 heretics were burned alive in Paris, without counting many who were sentenced to less cruel penalties. The procedure had been made more rapid. The police commissioner of the Chatelet dealt with cases summarily, and the Parliament confirmed. The victims had at first been strangled before they were burned; they were now burned alive, after the fashion of the Spanish Inquisition. The convicts were suspended by iron chains to beams which alternately "hoisted" and "lowered" them over the flames until the executioner cut the cord to let the sufferer fall. The evidence was burned together with the convicts. It was undesirable that the Reformers should be able to make a certified collection of their martyrs' acts and deeds. After a detailed and almost complacent enumeration of all these executions, we find in the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris this paragraph: "The rumor was, in June, 1535, that Pope Paul III, being advertised of the execrable and horrible justice which the king was doing upon the Lutherans in his kingdom, did send word to the King of France that he was advertised of it, and that he was quite willing to suppose that he did it in good part, as he still made use of the beautiful title he had, to be called the most Christian king. Nevertheless, God the Creator, when he was in this world, made more use of mercy than of rigorous justice, which should never be used rigorously, and that it was a cruel death to burn a man alive because he might have to some extent renounced the faith and the law. Wherefore the pope did pray and request the king, by his letters, to be pleased to mitigate the fury and rigor of his justice by granting grace and pardon. The king, wishing to follow the pope's wishes, according as he sent him word by his letters patent, sent word to the court of Parliament not to proceed any more with such rigor as they had shown heretofore. For this cause were there no more rigorous proceedings on the part of justice." End of section 24. Section 25 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 30. Francis I and the Reformation, Part 5. Search has been made to discover whether the assertion of the bourgeois de Paris has any foundation, whether Pope Paul III really did write in June 1535 the letter attributed to him, and whether its effect was that the king wrote to Parliament not to proceed against the Reformers "with such rigor." No proof has, however, been obtained as to the authenticity of the pope's letter, and in any case it was not very effectual, for the same bourgeois de Paris reports that in September 1535, 3 months after that, according to him, it was written, "Two fellows, makers of silk ribbons and tissues, were burned all alive, one in the Place Maubert and the other in St. John's Cemetery, as Lutherans, which they were. They had handed over to their host at Paris some Lutheran books to take care of, saying, 'Keep this book for us while we go into the city and show it to nobody.' When they were gone, this host was not able to refrain from showing this book to a certain priest, the which, after having looked at it, said incontinently, 'This is a very wicked book, and proscribed.' Then the said host went to the commissioner of police to reveal that he had such and such a book of such an one, the which sent forthwith to the house of the said host to take off and carry the said two fellows to the Chatelet. Being questioned, they confessed the state of the case. Whereupon, by sentence of the said commissioner, confirmed by decree, 'they made honorable amends in front of the church of Notre Dame de Paris, had their tongues cut out, and were burned all alive and with unshaken obstinacy.'" Proceedings and executions, then, did not cease, even in the case of the most humble class of Reformers, and at the very moment when Francis I was exerting himself to win over the Protestants of Germany with the cry of conciliation and re-establishment of harmony in the church. Melancthon, Bucer, and Luther himself had allowed themselves to be tempted by the prospect. But the German politicians, princes, and councillors were more clear-sighted. "We at Augsburg," wrote Seiler, deputy from that city, "know the King of France well; he cares very little for religion, or even for morality. He plays the hypocrite with the pope, and gives the Germans the smooth side of his tongue, thinking of nothing but how to cheat them of the hopes he gives them. His only aim is to crush the emperor." The attempt of Francis I thus failed, first in Germany, and then at Paris also, where the Sorbonne was not disposed, any more than the German politicians were, to listen to any talk about a specious conciliation; and the persecution resumed its course in France, paving the way for civil war. The last and most atrocious act of persecution in the reign of Francis I was directed not against isolated individuals, but against a whole population, harried, despoiled, and banished or exterminated on account of heresy. About the year 1525, small churches of Reformers began to assume organization between the Alps and the Jura. Something was there said about Christians who belonged to the Reformation without ever having been reformed. It was said that in certain valleys of the Piedmontese Alps and Dauphiny and in certain quarters of Provence there were to be found believers who for several centuries had recognized no authority save that of the Holy Scriptures. Some called them Vaudians or Valdensians, others poor of Lyons, others Lutherans. The rumor of the Reformation was heard in their valleys, and created a lively emotion amongst them. One of them determined to go and see what this Reformation was, and he returned to his valleys with good news and with pious books. Regular relations were from that time established between the Reformers of Switzerland, France, and Germany, and the Christian shepherds of these mountains. Visits were exchanged. Farel and Saunier went amongst the Vaudians and conversed with them about their common faith, common in spite of certain differences. Rustic conferences, composed of the principal landholders, barbas or pastors, and simple members of the faithful, met more than once in the open air under the pines of their mountains. The Vaudians of Provence had been settled there since the end of the 13th century, and in the course of the 14th other Vaudians from Dauphiny and even from Calabria had come thither to join them. "Their barbas," says a contemporary monk, "used to preside at their exercises of religion, which were performed in secret. As they were observed to be quiet and circumspect, as they faithfully paid taxes, tithe, and seigneurial dues, and as they were besides very laborious, they were not troubled on the score of their habits and doctrines." Their new friends from Switzerland and Germany reproached them with concealment of their faith and worship. As soon as they had overtly separated from the Roman Church, persecution began. Francis I. checked its first excesses, but it soon began again. The episcopal prisons were filled with Vaudians, who bristled at the summons to abjure; and on the 29th of March, 1535, 13 of them were sentenced to be burned alive. Pope Paul III. complained to Francis I. of their obstinacy. The king wrote about it to the Parliament of Aix. The Parliament ordered the lords of the lands occupied by the Vaudians to force their vassals to abjure or leave the country. When cited to appear before the court of Aix to explain the grounds of their refusal, several declined. The court sentenced them, in default, to be burned alive. Their friends took up arms and went to deliver the prisoners. Merindol was understood to be the principal retreat of the sectaries. By decree of November 18, 1540, the Parliament ordered that "the houses should be demolished and razed to the ground, the cellars filled up, the woods cut down, the trees of the gardens torn up, and that the lands of those who had lived in Merindol should not be able to be farmed out to anybody, whatever of their family or name." In the region of Parliament itself, complaints were raised against such hardships. The premier president, Barthélemy Chasseneux, was touched, and adjourned the execution of the decree. The king commissioned William du Bellay to examine into the facts. The report of du Bellay was favorable to the Vaudians, as honest, laborious, and charitable farmers, discharging all the duties of civil life; but at the same time he acknowledged that they did not conform to the laws of the church, that they did not recognize the pope or the bishops, that they prayed in the vulgar tongue, and that they were in the habit of choosing certain persons from amongst themselves to be their pastors. On this report, Francis I., by a declaration of February 18, 1541, pardoned the Vaudians for all that had been irregular in their conduct, on condition that, within the space of 3 months, they should abjure their errors; and he ordered the Parliament to send to Aix deputies from their towns, burghs, and villages to make abjuration in the name of all, at the same time authorizing the Parliament to punish, according to the ordinances, those who should refuse to obey, and to make use, if need were, of the services of the soldiery. Thus persecuted and condemned for their mere faith, undemonstrative as it was, the Vaudians confined themselves to asking that it might be examined and its errors pointed out. Those of Merindol and those of Cabrières in the countship of Venasque drew up their profession of faith and sent it to the king and to 2 bishops of the province, Cardinal Sadolet, Bishop of Carpentras, and John Dorandy, Bishop of Cavaillon, whose equity and moderation inspired them with some confidence. Cardinal Sadolet did not belie their expectation; he received them with kindness, discussed with them their profession of faith, pointed out to them diverse articles which might be remodelled without disavowing the basis of their creed, and assured them that it would always be against his sentiments to have them treated as enemies. "I am astonished," he wrote to the pope, "that these folks should be persecuted when the Jews are spared." The Bishop of Cavaillon testified towards them a favor less unalloyed. "I was quite sure," said he, "that there was not so much mischief amongst you as was supposed. However, to calm men's minds, it is necessary that you should submit to a certain appearance of abjuration." "But what would you have us abjure if we are already within the truth?" "It is but a simple formality that I demand of you. I do not require, in your case, notary or signature. If you are unwilling to assent to this abjuration, none can argue you into it." "We are plain men, Monseigneur; we are unwilling to do anything to which we cannot assent." And they persisted in their refusal to abjure. Cardinal Sadolet was summoned to Rome, and the premier president Chasseneux died suddenly. His successor, John de Maigné, Baron of Oppede, was a violent man, passionately bigoted, and, moreover, it is said, a personal enemy of the Vaudians of Cabrières, on which his estates bordered. He recommenced against them a persecution which was at first covert. They had found protectors in Switzerland and in Germany. At the instance of Calvin, the Swiss Protestant cantons and the German princes assembled at Schmalkalden wrote to Francis I. in their favor. It was to his interest to humour the Protestants of Germany, and that fact turned out to the advantage of the Vaudians of Provence; and on the 14th of June, 1544, he issued an edict which, suspending the proceedings commenced against them, restored to them their privileges, and ordered such of them as were prisoners to be set at large, "and as the attorney general of Provence," it goes on to say, "is related to the Archbishop of Aix, their sworn enemy, there will be sent in his place a councillor of the court for to inform me of their innocence." But some months later the peace of Crespy was made, and Francis I. felt no longer the same solicitude about humouring the Protestants of Switzerland and Germany. Baron d'Oppede zealously resumed his work against the Vaudians. He accused them of intriguing with foreign reformers, and of designing to raise 15,000 men to surprise Marseilles and form Provence into a republic. On the 1st of January, 1545, Francis I. signed, without reading it, they say, the revocation of his edict of 1544, and ordered execution of the decree issued by the Parliament of Aix, dated November 18, 1540, on the subject of the Vaudians, "notwithstanding all letters of grace posterior to that epoch, and ordered the governor of the province to give, for that purpose, the assistance of the strong hand to justice." The duty of assisting justice was assigned to Baron d'Oppede, and from the 7th to the 25th of April, 1545, 2 columns of troops, under the orders respectively of Oppede himself and Baron de la Garde, ravaged with fire and sword the 3 districts of Merindol, Cabrières, and Lacoste, which were peopled chiefly by Vaudians. We shrink from describing in detail all the horrors committed against a population without any means of self-defence by troops giving free rein to their brutal passions and gratifying the hateful passions of their leaders. In the end, 3 small towns and 22 villages were completely sacked. 763 houses, 89 cattle sheds, and 31 barns burned, 3,000 persons massacred, 255 executed subsequently to the massacre, after a mockery of trial, 600 or 700 sent to the galleys, many children sold for slaves, and the victors, on retiring, left behind them a double ordinance from the Parliament of Aix and the vice legate of Avignon, dated the 24th of April, 1545, forbidding "that any one, on pain of death, should dare to give asylum, aid, or succor, or furnish money or victuals to any Vaudian or heretic." It is said that Francis I., when near his end, repented of this odious extermination of a small population, which, with his usual fickleness and carelessness, he had at one time protected, and at another abandoned to its enemies. Amongst his last words to his son Henry II. Was an exhortation to cause an inquiry to be made into the iniquities committed by the Parliament of Aix in this instance. It will be seen, at the opening of Henry II.'s reign, what was the result of this exhortation of his father's. Calvin was lately mentioned as having pleaded the cause of the Vaudians, in 1544, amongst the Protestants of Switzerland and Germany. It was from Geneva, where he had lived and been the dominant spirit for many years, that the French Reformer had exercised such influence over the chiefs of the German Reformation in favor of that small population whose creed and morals had anticipated by several centuries the Reformation in the 16th century. He was born in 1509 at Noyon in Picardy, was brought up in the bosom of the Catholic Church, and held a cure in 1527 at Pont l'Evêque, where he preached several times, "joyous and almost proud," as he said himself, "that a single dissertation had brought me a cure." In 1534, study, meditation on the Gospels, discussion of the religious and moral questions raised on every side, and the free atmosphere of the new spirit that was abroad, changed his convictions and his resolves. He abandoned the career of the law as well as that of the established church, resigned his cure at Pont l'Evêque, and devoted himself entirely to the work of the nascent and much opposed Reformation. Having a mind that was judicious and free from illusion in the very heat of passion, he soon saw to what an extent the success of the Reformation in France was difficult and problematical. In 1535, impressed by the obstacles it met with even more than by the dangers it evoked, he resolved to leave his country and go else whither in search of security, liberty, and the possibility of defending a cause which became the dearer to him in proportion as it was the more persecuted. He had too much sagacity not to perceive that he was rapidly exhausting his various places of asylum. Queen Marguerite of Navarre was unwilling to try too far the temper of the king her brother. Canon Louis du Tillet was a little fearful lest his splendid library should be somewhat endangered through the use made of it by his guest, who went about arguing or preaching in the vicinity of Angouleme. The queen's almoner, Gerard Roussel, considered that Calvin was going too far, and grew apprehensive lest, if the Reformation should completely succeed, it might suppress the bishopric of Oloron which he desired, and which, indeed, he at a later period obtained. Lefebvre of Etaples, who was the most of all in sympathy with Calvin, was 79 years old, and had made up his mind to pass his last days in peace. Calvin quitted Angouleme and Nérac, and went to pass some time at Poitiers, where the friends of the Reformation, assembling round him and hanging upon his words, for the first time celebrated the Lord's Supper in a grotto close to the town, which still goes by the name of Calvin's Grotto. Being soon obliged to leave Poitiers, Calvin went to Orleans, then secretly to Paris, then to Noyon to see his family once more, and set out at last for Strasbourg, already one of the strongholds of the Reformation, where he had friends, amongst others the learned Bucer, with whom he had kept up a constant correspondence. He arrived there at the beginning of the year 1535. But it was not at Strasbourg that he took up his quarters. He preferred Bâle, where also there was a reunion of men of letters, scholars, and celebrated printers, Erasmus, Simon Grinet, or Grimius, and the Frobens, and where Calvin calculated upon finding the leisure and aid he required for executing the great work he had been for some time contemplating, his Institution de la Religion Chrétienne, or Christian Institutes. This would not be the place, and we have no intention, to sum up the religious doctrines of that book. We might challenge many of them as contrary to the true meaning and moral tendency of Christianity, but we desire to set in a clear light their distinctive and original characteristics, which are those of Calvin himself in the midst of his age. These characteristics are revealed in the preface and even in the dedication of the book. It is to Francis I., the persecutor of the French Reformers, during one of the most cruel stages of the persecution, and at the very moment when he had just left his own country in order that he may live in security and speak with freedom, that Calvin dedicates his work. "Do not imagine," he says to the king, "that I am attempting here my own special defence in order to obtain permission to return to the country of my birth, from which, although I fear for it such human affection as is my bounden duty, yet, as things are now, I do not suffer any great anguish at being cut off. But I am taking up the cause of all the faithful, and even that of Christ, which is in these days so mangled and downtrodden in your kingdom that it seems to be in a desperate plight. And this has no doubt come to pass rather through the tyranny of certain Pharisees than of your own free will." Calvin was at the same time the boldest and the least revolutionary amongst the innovators of the 16th century; bold as a Christian thinker, but full of deference and consideration towards authority, even when he was flagrantly withdrawing himself from it. The idea of his book was at first exclusively religious, and intended for the bulk of the French Reformers. But at the moment when Calvin is about to publish it, prudence and policy recur to his mind, and it is to the King of France that he addresses himself. It is the authority of the royal persecutor that he invokes. It is the reason of Francis I. that he attempts to convince. He acts like a respectful and faithful subject, as well as an independent and innovating Christian. End of section 25. Section 27 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 31. Henry II. 1547 to 1559, Part 1. Henry II. had all the defects, and, with the exception of personal bravery, not one amongst the brilliant and amiable qualities of the king his father. Like Francis I., he was rash and reckless in his resolves and enterprises, but without having the promptness, the fertility, and the suppleness of mind which Francis I. displayed in getting out of the awkward positions in which he had placed himself, and in stalling off or mitigating the consequences of them. Henry was as cold and ungenial as Francis had been gracious and able to please. And whilst Francis I., even if he were a bad master to himself, was at any rate his own master, Henry II. Submitted without resistance, and probably without knowing it, to the influence of the favorite who reigned in his house as well as in his court, and of the advisers who were predominant in his government. Two facts will suffice to set in a clear light, at the commencement of the new reign, this regrettable analogy in the defects and this profound diversity in the mind, character, and conduct of the two kings. Towards the close of 1542, a grievous aggravation of the tax upon salt, called Babel, caused a violent insurrection in the town of Rochelle, which was exempted, it was said, by its traditional privileges from that impost. Not only was payment refused, but the commissioners were maltreated and driven away. Francis I. considered the matter grave enough to require his presence for its repression. He repaired to Rochelle with a numerous body of lanzknechts. The terrified population appeared to have determined upon submission, and having assembled in a mass at the town hall, there awaited anxiously the king's arrival. On the 1st of January, 1543, Francis I. entered the town in state, surrounded by his escort. The people's advocate fell on his knees and appealed to the king's clemency in dealing with a revolt of which every one repented. The king, who was seated on a wooden boarding, rose up. "Speak we no more of revolt," said he. "I desire neither to destroy your persons nor to seize your goods, as was lately done by the Emperor Charles to the Ghentese, whereby his hands are stained with blood. I long more for the hearts of my subjects than for their lives and their riches. I will never at any time of my life think again of your offense, and I pardon you without accepting a single thing. I desire that the keys of your city and your arms be given back to you, and that you be completely reinstated in your liberties and your privileges." The cheers of the people responded to these words of the king. "I think I have won your hearts," said the king on retiring, "and I assure you, on the honor of a gentleman, that you have mine. I desire that you ring your bells, for you are pardoned." The Rochellese were let off for a fine of 200,000 francs, which the king gave to his keeper of the seals, Francis de Montholon, whom he wished to compensate for his good service. The keeper of the seals, in his turn, made a present of them to the town of Rochelle to found a hospital. But the ordinances as to the salt tax were maintained in principle, and their extension led some years afterwards to a rising of a more serious character, and very differently repressed. In 1548, hardly a year after the accession of Henry II., and in the midst of the rejoicings he had gone to be present at in the north of Italy, he received news at Turin to the effect that in Guienne, Angoumois, and Saintonge a violent and pretty general insurrection had broken out against the salt tax, which Francis I., shortly before his death, had made heavier in these provinces. The local authorities in vain attempted to repress the rising. The insurgent peasants scoured the country in strong bodies, giving free rein not only to their desires, but also to their revengeful feelings. The most atrocious excesses of which a mob is capable were committed. The director general of the Gabel was massacred cruelly, and 2 of his officers at Angouleme were strapped down stark naked on a table, beaten to death, and had their bodies cast into the river with the insulting remark, "Go, wicked Gabelers, and salt the fish of the Charente." The King of Navarre's lieutenant, being appealed to for aid, summoned, but to no purpose, the Parliament of Bordeaux. He was forced to take refuge in Chateau Trompette, and was massacred by the populace whilst he was trying to get out. The president of the Parliament, a most worthy magistrate, and very much beloved, it is said, by the people, only saved his own life by taking the oath prescribed by the insurgents. "This news," says Vieilleville in his contemporary Memoires, "grievously afflicted the king, and the Constable de Montmorency represented to him that it was not the first time that these people had been capricious, rebellious, and mutinous, for that in the reign of his lord and father, the late king, the Rochellese and surrounding districts had forgotten themselves in like manner. They ought to be exterminated, and, in the case of need, be replaced by a new colony, that they might never return. The said Sir Constable offered to take the matter in hand, and with 10 companies of the old hands whom he would raise in Piedmont, and as many lanzknechts, 1,000 men at arms all told, he promised to exact a full account and satisfy his Majesty." Montmorency was as good as his word. When he arrived with his troops in Guienne, the people of Bordeaux, in a fit of terror, sent to Langon a large boat, most magnificently fitted up, in which were chambers and saloons emblazoned with the arms of the said Sir Constable, with 3 or 4 deputies to present it to him, and beg him to embark upon it and drop down to their city. He repulsed them indignantly. "Away, away," said he, "with your boat and your keys. I will have naught to do with them. I have others here with me which will make me other kind of opening than yours. I will have you all hanged. I will teach you to rebel against your king and murder his governor and his lieutenant." And he did, in fact, enter Bordeaux on the 9th of October, 1548, by a breach which he had opened in the walls, and after having traversed the city between 2 lines of soldiers, and with his guns bearing on the suspected points, he ordered the inhabitants to bring all their arms to the citadel. Executions followed immediately after this moral as well as material victory. "More than 140 persons were put to death by various kinds of punishments," says Vieilleville, "and by a most equitable sentence, when the executioner had in his hands the 3 insurgents who had beaten to death and thrown into the river the 2 collectors of the Babel at Angouleme, he cast them all 3 into a fire which was ready at the spot, and said to them aloud, in conformity with the judgment against them, 'Go, rabid hounds, and grill the fish of the Charente, which ye salted with the bodies of the officers of your king and sovereign lord.' As to civil death, or loss of civil rights," adds Vieilleville, "nearly all the inhabitants made honorable amends in open street, on their knees, before the said lords at the window, crying mercy and asking pardon; and more than 100, because of their youth, were simply whipped. Astounding fines and interdictions were laid as well upon the body composing the court of Parliament as upon the town council and on a great number of private individuals. The very bells were not exempt from experiencing the wrath and vengeance of the prince, for not a single one remained throughout the city or in the open country, to say nothing of the clocks, which were not spared either, which was not broken up and confiscated to the king's service for his guns." The insurrection at Bordeaux against the Gabel in 1548 was certainly more serious than that of Rochelle in 1542. But it is also quite certain that Francis I. would not have set about repressing it as Henry II. did. He would have appeared there himself, and risked his own person instead of leaving the matter to the harshest of his lieutenants, and he would have more skilfully intermingled generosity with force, and kind words with acts of severity. And that is one of the secrets of governing. In 1549, scarcely 1 year after the revolt at Bordeaux, Henry II., then at Amiens, granted to deputies from Poitou, Rochelle, the district of Aunis, Limousin, Perigord, and Saintonge, almost complete abolition of the Babel in Guienne, which paid the king, by way of compensation, 200,000 crowns of gold for the expenses of war or the redemption of certain alienated domains. We may admit that on the day after the revolt the arbitrary and bloody proceedings of the Constable de Montmorency must have produced upon the insurgents of Bordeaux the effect of a salutary fright. But we may doubt whether so cruel a repression was absolutely indispensable in 1548, when in 1549 the concession demanded in the former year was to be recognized as necessary. According to de Thou and the majority of historians, it was on the occasion of the insurrection in Guienne against the Babel that Stéphane de la Boétie, the young and intimate friend of Montaigne, wrote his celebrated Discours de la servitude volontaire, ou Le Contraint, an eloquent declamation against monarchy. But the testimony of Montaigne himself upsets the theory of this coincidence. Written in his own hand upon a manuscript, partly autograph, of the treatise by de la Boétie, is a statement that it was the work "of a lad of 16." De la Boétie was born at Sarlat on the 1st of November, 1530, and was therefore 16 in 1546, 2 years before the insurrection at Bordeaux. The Contraint, besides, is a work of pure theory and general philosophy, containing no allusion at all to the events of the day, to the sedition in Guienne no more than to any other. This little work owed to Montaigne's affectionate regard for its author a great portion of its celebrity. published for the first time in 1578 in the Memoires de l'État de France, after having up to that time run its course without any author's name, any title, or any date, it was soon afterwards so completely forgotten that when, in the middle of the 17th century, Cardinal de Richelieu for the first time heard it mentioned, and "sent one of his gentlemen over the whole street of Saint Jacques to inquire for la servitude volontaire," all the publishers said, "We don't know what it is." The son of one of them recollected something about it, and said to the cardinal's gentleman, "Sir, there is a book fancier who has what you seek, but with no covers to it, and he wants 5 pistoles for it." "Very well," said the gentleman, and the Cardinal de Richelieu paid 50 francs for the pleasure of reading the little political pamphlet by "a lad of 16," which probably made very little impression upon him, but which, thanks to the elegance and vivacity of its style, and the affectionate admiration of the greatest independent thinker of the 16th century, has found a place in the history of French literature. History must do justice even to the men whose brutal violence she stigmatizes and reproves. In the case of Anne de Montmorency, it often took the form of threats intended to save him from the necessity of acts. When he came upon a scene of any great confusion and disorder, "Go hang me such a one," he would say, "tie yon fellow to that tree, dispatch this fellow with pikes and arquebuses, this very minute, right before my eyes, cut me in pieces all those rascals who chose to hold such a clock case as this against the king, burn me yonder village, light me up a blaze everywhere for a quarter of a mile all round." The same man paid the greatest attention to the discipline and good condition of his troops, in order to save the populations from their requisitions and excesses. "On the 20th of November, 1549, he obtained and published at Paris," says de Thou, "a proclamation from the king, doubling the pay of the men at arms, arquebusiers, and light horse, and forbidding them at the same time, on pain of death, to take anything without paying for it. A bad habit had introduced itself amongst the troops, whether they were going on service or returning, whether they were in the field or in winter quarters, of keeping themselves at the expense of those amongst whom they lived. Thence proceeded an infinity of irregularities and losses in the towns and in the country, wherein the people had to suffer at the hands of an insolent soldiery the same vexations as if it had been an enemy's country. Not only was a stop put to such excesses, but care was further taken that the people should not be oppressed under pretext of recruitments which had to be carried out." A nephew of the Constable de Montmorency, a young man of 23, who at a later period became Admiral de Coligny, was ordered to see to the execution of these protective measures, and he drew up, between 1550 and 1552, at first for his own regiment of foot, and afterwards as colonel general of this army, rules of military discipline which remained for a long while in force. There was war in the atmosphere. The king and his advisers, the court and the people, had their minds almost equally full of it, some in sheer dread, and others with an eye to preparation. The reign of Francis I. had ended mournfully. The peace of Crespy had hurt the feelings both of royalty and of the nation. Henry, now king, had as dauphin felt called upon to disavow it. It had left England in possession of Calais and Boulogne, and confirmed the dominion or ascendency of Charles V. in Germany, Italy, and Spain, on all the French frontiers. How was the struggle to be recommenced? What course must be adopted to sustain it successfully? To fall back upon, there were the 7 provincial legions, which had been formed by Francis I. for Normandy, Picardy, Burgundy, Dauphiny, and Provence united, Languedoc, Guienne, and Brittany. But they were not like permanent troops, drilled and always ready. They were recruited by voluntary enlistment. They generally remained at their own homes, receiving compensation at review time and high pay in time of war. The Constable de Montmorency had no confidence in these legions. He spoke of them contemptuously, and would much rather have increased the number of the foreign corps, regularly paid and kept up Swiss or lanzknechts. 2 systems of policy and warfare, moreover, divided the king's council in two. Montmorency, now old and worn out in body and mind—he was born in 1492, and so was 60 in 1552— was for a purely defensive attitude, no adventures or battles to be sought, but victuals and all sorts of supplies to be destroyed in the provinces which might be invaded by the enemy, so that instead of winning victories there, he might not even be able to live there. In 1536, this system had been found successful by the Constable in causing the failure of Charles V.'s invasion of Provence. But in 1550, a new generation had come into the world, the court and the army. It comprised young men full of ardor and already distinguished for their capacity and valor. Francis de Lorraine, Duke of Guise, born at the castle of Bar February 17, 1519, was 31. His brother, Charles de Guise, Cardinal of Lorraine, was only 26. He was born at Joinville, February 17, 1524. Francis de Scepo, born at Dortal, Anjou, in 1510, who afterwards became Marshal de Vieilleville, was at this time nearly 40, but he had contributed in 1541 to the victory of Ceresole, and Francis I. had made so much of it that he had said on presenting him to his son Henry, "He is no older than you, and see what he has done already. If the wars do not swallow him up, you will some day make him constable or marshal of France." Gaspard de Coligny, born at Châtillon-sur-Loing, February 16, 1517, was 33, and his brother, Francis d'Andelot, born at Châtillon in 1521, 29. These men, warriors and politicians at the same time, in a high social position and in the flower of their age, could not reconcile themselves to the Constable de Montmorency's system, defensive solely and prudential to the verge of inertness. They thought that in order to repair the reverses of France, and for the sake of their own fame, there was something else to be done, and they impatiently awaited the opportunity. End of section 27. Section 28 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 31. Henry II, 1547 to 1559, Part 2. It was not long coming. At the close of 1551, a deputation of the Protestant princes of Germany came to Fontainebleau to ask for the king's support against the aggressive and persecuting despotism of Charles V. The Count of Nassau made a speech, "very long," says Vieilleville in his Memoire, at the same time that it was in very elegant language, whereby all the presents received very great contentment. Next day the king put the demand before his council for consideration, and expressed at the very outset his own opinion that, "in the present state of affairs, he ought not to take up any enterprise, but leave his subjects of all conditions to rest, for generally," said he, "all have suffered and do suffer when armies pass and repass so often through my kingdom, which cannot be done without pitiable oppression and trampling down of the poor people." The constable, "without respect of persons," says Vieilleville, following his custom of not giving way to anybody, forthwith began to speak, saying that the king, who asked counsel of them, had very plainly given it them himself, and made them very clearly to understand his own idea, which ought to be followed point by point without any gainsaying, he having said nothing but what was most equitable and well known to the company. Nearly all the members of the council gave in their adhesion, without comment, to the opinion of the king and the constable. "But when it came to the turn of M. de Vieilleville, who had adopted the language of the court of Nassau," he unhesitatingly expressed a contrary opinion, unfolding all the reasons which the king had for being distrustful of the emperor, and for not letting this chance of enfeebling him slip by. "May it please your Majesty," said he, "to remember his late passage through France, to obtain which the emperor submitted to carte blanche. Nevertheless, when he was well out of the kingdom, he laughed at all his promises, and when he found himself inside Cambrai, he said to the Prince of Infantado, Let not the King of France, if he be wise, put himself at my mercy, as I have been at his, for I swear by the living God that he shall not be quit for Burgundy and Champagne, but I would also insist upon Picardy and the key of the road to the Bastille of Paris, unless he were minded to lose his life or be confined in perpetual imprisonment until the whole of my wish were accomplished. Since thus it is, sir, and the emperor makes war upon you covertly, it must be made upon him overtly, without concealing one's game or dissimulating at all. No excuses must be allowed on the score of neediness, for France is inexhaustible, if only by voluntary loans raised on the most comfortable classes of the realm. As for me, I consider myself one of the poorest of the company, or at any rate one of the least comfortable, but yet I have some 15,000 francs worth of plate, dinner, and dessert, white and red, silver and gold, which I hereby offer to place in the hands of whomsoever you shall appoint, in order to contribute to the expenses of so laudable an enterprise as this. Putting off, moreover, for the present, the communication to you of a certain secret matter which one of the chiefs of this embassy hath told me, and I am certain that when you have discovered it, you will employ all your might and means to carry out that which I propose to you." End quote. The king asked Vieilleville what this secret matter was which he was keeping back. "If it please your Majesty to withdraw apart, I will tell it you," said Vieilleville. All the council rose, and Vieilleville, approaching his Majesty, who called the constable only to his side, said, "Sir, you are well aware how the emperor got himself possessed of the imperial cities of Cambrai, Utrecht, and Liege, which he has incorporated with his own countship of Flanders, to the great detriment of the whole of Germany. The electoral princes of the Holy Empire have discovered that he has a project in his mind of doing just the same with the imperial cities of Metz, Strasbourg, Toul, Verdun, and such other towns on the Rhine as he shall be able to get hold of. They have secretly adopted the idea of throwing themselves upon your resources, without which they cannot stop this detestable design, which would be the total ruin of the empire and a manifest loss to your kingdom. Wherefore, take possession of the said towns, since opportunity offers, which will be about 40 leagues of country gained without the loss of a single man, and an impregnable rampart for Champagne and Picardy, and besides a fine and perfectly open road into the heart of the Duchy of Luxembourg and the districts below it as far as Brussels." End quote. However pacific the king's first words had been, and whatever was the influence of the constable, the proposal of Vieilleville had a great effect upon the council. The king showed great readiness to adopt it. "I think," said he to the constable, "that I was inspired of God when I created Vieilleville of my council to day." "I only gave the opinion I did," replied Montmorency, "in order to support the king's sentiments. Let your Majesty give what orders you please." The king loudly proclaimed his resolve. "Then let every one," he said, "be ready at an early date, with equipment according to his ability and means, to follow me, hoping, with God's help, that all will go well for the discomfiture of so pernicious a foe of my kingdom and nation, and one who revels and delights in tormenting all manner of folks without regard for any." There was a general enthusiasm. The place of meeting for the army was appointed at Chalon-sur-Marne, March 10, 1552. More than 1,000 gentlemen flocked thither as volunteers. Peasants and mechanics from Champagne and Picardy joined them. The war was popular. "The majority of the soldiers," says Rabutin, a contemporary chronicler, "were young men whose brains were on fire." Francis de Guise and Gaspard de Coligny were their chief leaders. The king entered Lorraine from Champagne by Joinville, the ordinary residence of the Dukes of Guise. He carried Pont-à-Mousson. Toul opened its gates to him on the 13th of April. He occupied Nancy on the 14th, and on the 18th he entered Metz, not without some hesitation amongst a portion of the inhabitants and the necessity of a certain show of military force on the part of the leaders of the royal army. The king would have given the command of this important place to Vieilleville, but he refused it, saying, "I humbly thank your Majesty, but I do not think that you should establish in Metz any governor in your own name, but leave that duty to the mayor and sheriffs of the city, under whose orders the 8 captains of the old train bands who will remain there with their companies will be."
"How say you?" said the king. "Can I leave a foreign lieutenant in a foreign country, whose oath of fidelity I have only had within the last 24 hours, and with all the difficulties and disputes in the world to meet too?" "Sir," rejoined Vieilleville, "to fear that this master sheriff, whose name is Talange, might possibly do you a bad turn, is to wrongly estimate his own competence, who never put his nose anywhere but into a bar parlor to drink himself drunk; and it is also to show distrust of the excellent means you have for preventing all the ruses and artifices that might be invented to throw your service into confusion." The king acquiesced, but not without anxiety, in Vieilleville's refusal; and, leaving at Metz as governor a relative of the constable's, whom the latter warmly recommended to him, he set out on the 22d of April, 1552, with all his household, to go and attempt in Alsace the same process that he had already carried out in Lorraine. "But when we had entered upon the territory of Germany," says Vieilleville, "our Frenchmen at once showed their insolence in their very first quarters, which so alarmed all the rest that we never found from that moment a single man to speak to, and as long as the expedition lasted, there never appeared a soul with his provisions to sell on the road, whereby the army suffered infinite privations. This misfortune began with us at the approach to Saverne, or Zabern, the episcopal residence of Strasbourg." When the king arrived before Strasbourg, he found the gates closed, and the only offer to open them was on the condition that he should enter alone with 40 persons for his whole suite. The constable, having taken a rash fit, was of opinion that he should enter even on this condition. This advice was considered by his Majesty to be very sound, as well as by the princes and lords who were about him, according to the natural tendency of the Frenchman, who is always for seconding and applauding what is said by the great. But Vieilleville, on being summoned to the king's quarters, opposed it strongly. "Sir," said he, "break this purpose, for in carrying it out you are in danger of incurring some very evil and very shameful fate, and should that happen, what will become of your army, which will be left without head, prince, or captain, and in a strange country, wherein we are already looked upon with ill will because of our insolence and indiscretions? As for me, I am off again to my quarters to quaff and laugh with my 200 men at arms, in readiness to march when your standard is afield, but not thither." Nothing has a greater effect upon weak and undecided minds than the firm language of men resolved to do as they say. The king gave up the idea of entering Strasbourg, and retired well pleased nevertheless, for he was in possession of Metz, Toul, Verdun, and Pont-à-Mousson, the keys for France into Germany, and at the head of an army under young commanders who were enterprising without being blindly rash. Charles V. also had to know what necessity was, and to submit to it, without renouncing the totality of his designs. On the 2d of August, 1552, he signed at Passau, with the Protestant princes, the celebrated treaty known under the name of "Treaty of Public Peace," which referred the great questions of German pacification to a general diet to be assembled in 6 months, and declared that, pending definitive conciliation, the two religions should be on an equal footing in the empire, that is, that the princes and free towns should have the supreme regulation of religious matters amongst themselves. Charles V. thus recovered full liberty of action in his relations with France, and could no longer think of anything but how to recover the important towns he had lost in Lorraine. Henry II., on the other hand, who was asked by his Protestant allies on what conditions he would accept the peace of Passau, replied that at no price would he dispossess himself of the 3 bishoprics of Lorraine, and that he would, for his part, continue the contest he had undertaken for the liberation of Germany. The siege of Metz then became the great question of the day. Charles V. made all his preparations to conduct it on an immense scale, and Henry II. immediately ordered Francis de Guise to go and defend his new conquest at all hazards. Ambition which is really great accepts with joy great perils fraught with great opportunities. Guise wrote to Henry II.'s favorite, Diana de Poitiers, Duchess of Valentinois, to thank her for having helped to obtain for him this favor, which was about to bring him "to the emperor's very beard." He set out at once, first of all to Toul, where the plague prevailed, and where he wished to hurry on the repair of the ramparts. Money was wanting to pay the working corps, and he himself advanced the necessary sum. On arriving at Metz on the 17th of August, 1552, he found there only 12 companies of infantry, new levies, and every evening he drilled them himself in front of his quarters. A host of volunteers, great lords, simple gentlemen, and rich and brave burgesses soon came to him, eager to aid him in repelling the greatest and most powerful effort ever made by the emperor against their country and their king." This concourse of warriors, the majority of them well known and several of them distinguished, redoubled the confidence and ardor of the rank and file in the army. We find, under the title of Chanson faite en 1552 par un soldat étant à Metz en garrison, this couplet: My Lord of Guise is here at home, with many a noble at his side, with the 2 children of Vendome, with bold Nemours in all his pride, and Strozzi too, a warrior tried, who ceases not by night or day around the city walls to stride, and strengthen Metz in every way. Peter Strozzi, "the man in all the world," says Brantome, "who could best arrange and order battles and battalions, and could best post them to his advantage." To put into condition the tottering fortifications of Metz, and to have the place well supplied, was the first task undertaken by its indefatigable governor. He never ceased to meet the calls upon him either in person or in purse. He was seen directing the workmen, taking his meals with them, and setting them a good example by carrying the hod for several hours. He frequently went out on horseback to reconnoitre the country, visit the points of approach and lodgment that the enemy might make use of around the town, and take measures of precaution at the places whereby they might do harm, as well as at those where it would be not only advantageous for the French to make sallies or to set ambuscades, but also to secure a retreat. Charles V., naturally slow as he was in his operations no less than in his resolves, gave the activity of Guise time to bear fruit. "I mean to batter the town of Metz in such style as to knock it about the ears of M. de Guise," said he at the end of August, 1552, "and I make small account of the other places that the king may have beyond that." On the 15th of September following, Charles was still 15 leagues from Metz, on the territory of Deux Ponts, and it was only on the 19th of October that the Duke of Alba, his captain general, arrived with 24,000 men, the advance guard, within a league of the place which, it is said, was to be ultimately besieged by 100,000 foot, 23,000 horse, 120 pieces of artillery, and 7,000 pioneers. "After one and the first encounter," says a journal of the siege, "the enemy held our soldiers in good repute, not having seen them for any sort of danger, advance, or retreat, save as men of war and of assured courage, which was an advantage, for M. de Guise knew well that at the commencement of a war it was requisite that a leader should try, as much as ever he could, to win." It was only on the 20th of November that Charles V., ill of gout at Thionville and unable to stand on his legs, perceived the necessity of being present in person at the siege, and appeared before Metz on an Arab horse, with his face pale and worn, his eyes sunk in his head, and his beard white. At sight of him there was a most tremendous salute of arquebuses and artillery, the noise of which brought the whole town to arms. The emperor, whilst waiting to establish himself at the castle of La Hargne, took up his quarters near the Duke of Alba, in a little wooden house built out of the ruins of the Abbey of Saint Clement. "A beautiful palace," said he, "when the keys of Metz are brought to me there." From the 20th to the 26th the attack was continued with redoubled vigor. 14,000 cannon shots were fired, it is said, in a single day. Guise had remarked that the enemy seemed preparing to direct the principal assault against a point so strong that nobody had thought of pulling down the houses in its vicinity. This oversight was immediately repaired, and a stout wall, the height of a man, made out of the ruins. "If they send us peas," said Guise, "we will give them black beans," or "we will give them at least as good as they bring." On the 26th of November, the old wall was battered by a formidable artillery, and, breached in 3 places, it crumbled down on the 28th into the ditch, "at the same time making it difficult to climb for to come to the assault." The assailants uttered shouts of joy, but when the cloud of dust had cleared off, they saw a fresh rampart 8 feet in height above the breach, "and they experienced as much and even more disgust than they had felt pleasure at seeing the wall tumble." The besieged heaped mockery and insult upon them. But Guise "imperatively put a stop to the disturbance, fearing, it is said, lest some traitor should take advantage of it to give the assailants some advice, and the soldiers then conceived the idea of sticking upon the points of their pikes live cats, the cries of which seemed to show derision of the enemy." The siege went on for a month longer without making any more impression, and the imperial troops kicked against any fresh assaults. "I was wont once upon a time to be followed to battle," Charles V. would say, "but I see that I have no longer men about me. I must bid farewell to the empire and go shut myself up in some monastery. Before 3 years are over, I shall turn Cordelier." Whilst Metz was still holding out, the fortress of Toul was summoned by the Imperialists to open its gates. But the commandant replied, "When the town of Metz has been taken, when I have had the honor of being besieged in due form by the emperor, and when I have made as long a defence as the Duke of Guise has, such a summons may be addressed to me, and I will consider what I am to do." On the 26th of December, 1552, the 65th day since the arrival of the imperial army, and the 45th since the batteries had opened fire, Charles V. resolved to raise the siege. "I see very well," said he, "that fortune resembles women; she prefers a young king to an old emperor." His army filed off by night, in silence, leaving behind its munitions and its tents, just as they stood, "driven away almost by the chastisement of Heaven," says the contemporary chronicler Rabutin, "with but 2 shots by way of signal." The ditty of the soldier just quoted ends thus: "At last, so stout was her defence, from Metz they moved their guns away, and with the laugh at their expense, a tramping went their whole array. And at their tail the noble lord of Guise sent forth a goodly throng of cavalry with lance and sword, to teach them how to tramp along." Guise was far from expecting so sudden and decisive a result. "Sing me no more flattering strains in your letters about the emperor's dislodgement hence," he wrote on the 24th of December to his brother the Cardinal of Lorraine. "Take it for certain that, unless we be very much mistaken in him, he will not, as long as he has life, brook the shame of departing hence until he has seen it all out." End of section 28.
Section 29 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 31. Henry II, 1547 to 1559, Part 3. Irritated, and perhaps still more shocked, at so heavy a blow to his power and his renown, Charles V. looked everywhere for a chance of taking his revenge. He flattered himself that he had found it in Therouanne, a fortress of importance at that time between Flanders and Artois, which had always been a dependency of the kingdom of France, and served as a rampart against the repeated incursions of the English, the masters of Calais. Charles knew that it was ill supplied with troops and munitions of war, and the court of Henry II, intoxicated with the deliverance of Metz, spoke disdainfully of the emperor, and paid no heed to anything but balls, festivals, and tournaments in honor of the marriage between Diana d'Angouleme, the king's natural daughter, and Horatio Farnese, Duke of Castro. All of a sudden it was announced that the troops of Charles V. were besieging Therouanne. The news was at first treated lightly. It was thought sufficient to send to Therouanne some reinforcements under the orders of Francis de Montmorency, the nephew of the constable; but the attack was repulsed with spirit by the besiegers, and brave as was the resistance offered by the besieged, who sustained for 10 hours a sanguinary assault, on the 20th of June, 1553, Francis de Montmorency saw the impossibility of holding out longer, and, on the advice of all his officers, offered to surrender the place; but he forgot to stipulate
in the first place for a truce. The Germans entered the town, thrown open without terms of capitulation. It was given up as prey to an army itself a prey to all the passions of soldiers as well as to their master's vengeful feelings, and Therouanne, handed over for devastation, was for a whole month diligently demolished and razed to the ground. When Charles V. at Brussels received news of the capture, "bonfires were lighted throughout Flanders, bells were rung, cannon were fired." It was but a poor revenge for so great a sovereign after the reverse he had just met with at Metz, but the fall of Therouanne was a grievous incident for France. Francis I. was in the habit of saying that Therouanne in Flanders and Ac, now Dax, on the frontier of Guienne, were to him like two pillows on which he could rest tranquilly. Whilst these events were passing in Lorraine and Flanders, Henry II. And his advisers were obstinately persisting in the bad policy which had been clung to by Charles VIII., Louis XII., and Francis I., that, in fact, of making conquests and holding possessions in Italy. War continued from Turin to Naples, between France, the emperor, the pope, and the local princes, with all sorts of alliances and alternations, but with no tangible result. Blaise de Montluc defended the fortress of Siena for 9 months against the Imperialists with an intelligence and a bravery which earned for him, 20 years later, the title of Marshal of France. Charles de Brissac was carrying on the war in Piedmont with such a combination of valor and generosity that the king sent him as a present his own sword, writing to him at the same time, "The opinion I have of your merit has become rooted even amongst foreigners. The emperor says that he would make himself monarch of the whole world if he had a Brissac to second his plans." His men, irritated at getting no pay, one day surrounded Brissac, complaining vehemently. "You will always get bread by coming to me," said he, and he paid the debt of France by sacrificing his daughter's dowry and borrowing a heavy sum from the Swiss on the security of his private fortune. It was by such devotion and such sacrifices that the French nobility paid for and justified their preponderance in the state, but they did not manage to succeed in the conduct of public affairs and to satisfy the interests of a nation progressing in activity, riches, independence, and influence. Disquieted at the smallness of his success in Italy, Henry II. Flattered himself that he would regain his ascendency there by sending thither the Duke of Guise, the hero of Metz, with an army of about 20,000 men, French or Swiss, and a staff of experienced officers. But Guise was not more successful than his predecessors had been. After several attempts, by arms and negotiation amongst the local sovereigns, he met with a distinct failure in the kingdom of Naples, before the fortress of Civitella, the siege of which he was forced to raise on the 15th of May, 1557. Wearied out by want of success, sick in the midst of an army of sick, regretting over "the pleasures of his field sports at Joinville, and begging his mother to have just a word or two written to him to console him," all he sighed for was to get back to France; and it was not long before the state of affairs recalled him thither. It was now nearly 2 years ago that, on the 25th of October, 1555, and on the 1st of January, 1556, Charles V. had solemnly abdicated all his dominions, giving over to his son Philip the kingdom of Spain, with the sovereignty of Burgundy and the Low Countries, and to his younger brother Ferdinand the empire together with the original heritage of the House of Austria, and retiring personally to the monastery of Yuste in Estremadura, there to pass the last years of his life, distracted with gout, at one time resting from the world and its turmoil, at another vexing himself about what was doing there now that he was no longer in it. Before abandoning it for good, he desired to do his son Philip the service of leaving him, if not in a state of definite peace, at any rate in a condition of truce with France. Henry II. Also desired rest, and the Constable of Montmorency wished above everything for the release of his son Francis, who had been a prisoner since the fall of Therouanne. A truce for 5 years was signed at Vaucelles on the 5th of February, 1556, and Coligny, quite young still, but already admiral and in high esteem, had the conduct of the negotiation. He found Charles V. dressed in mourning, seated beside a little table in a modest apartment hung with black. When the admiral handed to the emperor the king's letter, Charles could not himself break the seal, and the Bishop of Arras drew near to render him that service. "Gently, my lord of Arras," said the emperor, "would you rob me of the duty I am bound to discharge towards the king my brother in law? Please God, none but I shall do it." And then turning to Coligny, he said, What will you say of me, admiral? Am I not a pretty knight to run a course and break a lance, I who can only with great difficulty open a letter?" He inquired with an air of interest after Henry II.'s health, and boasted of belonging himself also to the house of France through his grandmother Mary of Burgundy. "I hold it to be an honor," said he, "to have issued, on the mother's side, from the stock which wears and upholds the most famous crowns in the world." His son Philip, who was but a novice in kingly greatness, showed less courtesy and less good taste than his father. He received the French ambassadors in a room hung with pictures representing the battle of Pavia. There were some who concluded that from that the truce would not be of long duration. And it was not long before their prognostication was verified. The sending of the Duke of Guise into Italy, and the assistance he brought to Pope Paul IV., then at war with the new King of Spain, Philip II., were considered as a violation of the truce of Vaucelles. Henry II. Had expected as much, and had ordered Coligny, who was commanding in Picardy and Flanders, to hold himself in readiness to take the field as soon as he should be, if not forced, at any rate naturally called upon, by any unforeseen event. It cost Coligny, who was a man of scrupulous honor, a great struggle to lightly break a truce he had just signed. Nevertheless, in January 1557, when he heard that the French were engaged in Italy in the war between the pope and the Spaniards, he did not consider that he could possibly remain inactive in Flanders. He took by surprise the town of Lens, between Lille and Arras. Philip II., on his side, had taken measures for promptly entering upon the campaign. By his marriage with Mary Tudor, Queen of England, he had secured for himself a powerful ally in the north. The English Parliament were but little disposed to compromise themselves in a war with France. But, in March 1557, Philip went to London, the queen's influence and the distrust excited in England by Henry II. Prevailed over the pacific desires of the nation, and Mary sent a simple herald to carry to the King of France at Rheims her declaration of war. Henry accepted it politely but resolutely. "I speak to you in this way," said he to the herald, "because it is a queen who sends you. Had it been a king, I would speak to you in a very different tone." And he ordered him to be gone forthwith from the kingdom. A negotiation was commenced for accomplishing the marriage, long since agreed upon, between the young Queen of Scotland, Mary Stuart, and Henry II.'s son, Francis, Dauphin of France. Mary, who was born on the 8th of December, 1542, at Falkland Castle in Scotland, had, since 1548, lived and received her education at the court of France, whither her mother, Mary of Lorraine, eldest sister of Francis de Guise, and Queen Dowager of Scotland, had lost no time in sending her as soon as the future union between the two children had been agreed upon between the two courts. The Dauphin of France was a year younger than the Scottish princess, but, "from his childhood," says Venetian Capello, "he has been very much in love with her most serene little highness the Queen of Scotland, who is destined for his wife. It sometimes happens that when they are exchanging endearments, they like to retire quite apart into a corner of the rooms, that their little secrets may not be overheard." On the 19th of April, 1558, the espousals took place in the great hall of the Louvre, and the marriage was celebrated in the church of Notre Dame. From that time, Mary Stuart was styled in France Queen Dauphiness, and her husband, with the authorization of the Scottish commissioners, took the title of King Dauphin. "Etiquette required at that time that the heir to the throne should hold his court separately, and not appear at the king's court save on grand occasions. The young couple resigned themselves without any difficulty to this exile, and retired to Villers Cotterets." Whilst preparations were being made at Paris for the rejoicings in honor of the union of the two royal children, war broke out in Picardy and Flanders. Philip II. Had landed there with an army of 47,000 men, of whom 7,000 were English. Never did any great sovereign and great politician provoke and maintain for long such important wars without conducting them in some other fashion than from the recesses of his cabinet, and without ever having exposed his own life on the field of battle. The Spanish army was under the orders of Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, a young warrior of 30 who had won the confidence of Charles V. He led it to the siege of Saint Quentin, a place considered as one of the bulwarks of the kingdom. Philip II. Remained at some leagues' distance in the environs. Henry II. Was ill prepared for so serious an attack. His army, which was scarcely 20,000 strong, mustered near Laon, under the orders of the Duke of Nevers, At the end of July, 1557, it hurried into Picardy, under the command of the Constable de Montmorency, who was supported by Admiral de Coligny, his nephew, by the Duke of Enghien, by the Prince of Conde, and by the Duke of Montpensier, by nearly all the great lords and valiant warriors of France. They soon saw that Saint Quentin was in a deplorable state of defence. The fortifications were old and badly kept up. Soldiers, munitions of war, and victuals were all equally deficient. Coligny did not hesitate. However, he threw himself into the place on the 2d of August during the night with a small corps of 700 men and Saint Remy, a skilled engineer who had already distinguished himself in the defence of Metz. The admiral packed off the useless mouths, repaired the walls at the points principally threatened, and reanimated the failing courage of the inhabitants. The constable and his army came within hail of the place, and D'Andelot, Coligny's brother, managed with great difficulty to get 450 men into it. On the 10th of August, the battle was begun between the two armies. The constable affected to despise the Duke of Savoy's youth. "I will soon show him," said he, "a move of an old soldier." The French army, very inferior in numbers, was for a moment on the point of being surrounded. The Prince of Conde sent the constable warning. "I was serving in the field," answered Montmorency, "before the Prince of Conde came into the world. I have good hopes of still giving him lessons in the art of war for some years to come." The valor of the constable and his comrades in arms could not save them from the consequences of their stubborn recklessness and their numerical inferiority. The battalions of Gascon infantry closed their ranks with pikes to the front, and made an heroic resistance, but all in vain, against repeated charges of the Spanish cavalry, and the defeat was total. More than 3,000 men were killed. The number of prisoners amounted to double, and the constable, left upon the field with his thigh shattered by a cannon ball, fell into the hands of the Spaniards, as was also the case with the Dukes of Longueville and Montpensier, La Rochefoucauld, d'Aubigne, etc. The Duke of Enghien, Viscount de Turenne, and a multitude of others, many great names amidst a host of obscure, fell in the fight. The Duke of Nevers and the Prince of Conde, sword in hand, reached La Fere with the remnants of their army. Coligny remained alone in Saint Quentin with those who survived of his little garrison, and 120 arquebusiers, whom the Duke of Nevers threw into the place at a loss of 3 times as many. Coligny held out for a fortnight longer, behind walls that were in ruins and were assailed by a victorious army. At length, on the 27th of August, the enemy entered Saint Quentin by shoals. "The admiral, who was still going about the streets with a few men to make head against them, found himself hemmed in on all sides, and did all he could to fall into the hands of a Spaniard, preferring rather to await on the spot the common fate than to incur by flight any shame and reproach. He who took him prisoner, after setting him to rest a while at the foot of the ramparts, took him away to their camp, where, as he entered, he met Captain Alonso de Caziere, commandant of the old bands of Spanish infantry, when up came the Duke of Savoy, who ordered the said Caziere to take the admiral to his tent." D'Andelot, the admiral's brother, succeeded in escaping across the marshes. Being thus master of Saint Quentin, Philip II, after having attempted to put a stop to carnage and plunder, expelled from the town, which was half in ashes, the inhabitants who had survived, and the small adjacent fortresses, Ham and Catelet, were not long before they surrendered. Section 29.